Imagine you lived 10,000 years ago. What would be the best method to measure the passage of time? You could just count all day long, but that probably doesn't work. You could designate one member of the clan who's the counter, who has to do it all, but that wouldn't work. The hourglass has not been invented. And how big of a glass would you need for a day? Maybe you start with a day. The sun disappears, the sun reappears. It happens every day. It, in fact, is a day. You might tell myths like the sun god Helios that rides his chariot across the sky and at night resets from west to east, so he's on the east side again every day. Now, how do we count the days today? It's 24 hours of 60 minutes each, and 60 minutes of 60 seconds each. And a second is measured technically as a certain number of oscillations of a radioactive element. Nothing natural about any of it. I mean, the radioactive element is natural, but the 60 and the 24, and it has nothing to do with what's happening out there in the heavens, in the sky, in the world. We do know that the sum total of that period of a day is one rotation of the Earth. Not an orbit around the sun, but the Earth spinning on its axis one time around is one day. We remember it's not Helios and the sun going around the Earth. It's the Earth rotating, facing the sun and then not. So let's say we count up the days and we want to count many days. How do we do that? Well, most people, most cultures have come up with a concept of the year. When the length of the day is the same as it was a year before. That's how you define a year. You could use it based on elements of the sun's cycle, right? The solstice or the equinox, those are each a full year's worth, 365 days apart from one summer solstice to the next summer solstice. We know that a lot of cultures knew this was true. The annual flooding of the Nile in Egypt happened every 365 days. Babylonian astronomers knew how to count the days and how to mark the solstice and the equinox. In fact, the Babylonian astronomers could count even further. They marked the rising of certain constellations and the movement of constellations across the sky that took many years to accomplish. In fact, some astronomers even today use the Babylonian observations as the starting point for marking the cycle of those seasons, but that's many years together. For counting just 1 year, we can use the sun and the length of the day. Now today, with all of our science, we know that a full trip of the Earth around the sun is not exactly 365 days. It's 365.256 days. If it was just 0.25, that would make the calendar easy, right? You just have a leap year every 4 years, but it's 0.256. If you count up enough years, that 0.006 is going to add up to something. So the calendar that we use today, called the Gregorian calendar, is actually a leap year every 4 years, unless the year is divisible by 100, in which case it's not a leap year, unless that number is also divisible by 400. Then it is a leap year again. So 1900 was not a leap year, but 2000 was a leap year because of the 400 rule. And that's kept us more or less on target with that 365.256. But in both cases of these measurements, the day and the year, we are long past looking up at the sky, looking up to the sun to figure out when we are. We look down at a watch. We look down at our phone at a little icon in the corner of the screen. That tells us when we are. Now, there is another bright celestial orb in the sky. It's there 24 hours a day, even if we can't see it when the sun is out. And then it disappears. And it gradually comes back into view every 29 to 30 days. Of course, it's always there in full, but we can only see parts of it because we, the Earth, block some of the light coming to it. It's the moon. It used to be very important in human culture and in Jewish culture. It helped to define time between the day and the year, and it could define moments and possibilities as it grew and declined. As I mentioned earlier, tonight is actually a Jewish holiday. It's called Rosh Chodesh Av, the beginning of the month of Av. You know that the moon is important in the Jewish calendar because days begin at night. Hanukkah begins at night, Rosh Hashanah begins at night, Passover begins at night, because that's when the moon begins to come out. Of course, it's odd that we have no universal start point for a day. Does a day start when you see two stars at night? Does a day start at midnight? What does that have to do with anything? Does it start at dawn? You could count your days from dawns. Any number of possibilities. But the moon was important for Jewish culture and counting, and that's why we mark the beginning of the month as an important time. Now, what did and what does the moon mean for humanity today? In the prehistoric and ancient world, where the only light on Earth was fire that we tended for ourselves, like these candles, the bright light of a full moon would make the world look different. Today we have street lights and house lights and city lights and our cell phone flashlight. It's made the moon a pale imitation of what it used to be in our lives. I'm interested to ask you, have you ever been far away from civilization, such that you've experienced just moonlight, just moon shadows? What looked different to you about the world when you saw it just by the light of the moon and no other light? If anyone wants to share, I'll repeat what's said into the microphone so people online can hear as well. Yeah, go ahead. So the examples are going camping or traveling to Iceland. If you were there during the summer, it's daylight almost all the time. You almost miss the moonlight, but you're certainly feeling part of that cosmic experience. And then if you're there in the wintertime when it's night almost all the time, then the moon's presence becomes very important. Anyone else have a memory of moonlight experience? Sure. So if you're out in northern Wisconsin, a very rural area, and you go outside when the moon is out before the stars have really come out, and that's really the only light you see, you almost feel closer to the earth, closer to the natural world by experiencing just the moon in that setting. What about the opposite? Have you ever been away from civilization and there's no moon? And it's a cloudy night and there's no sky and it's as dark as the world can be? Yes, Ed. Under those conditions. Yeah, Ed was describing, he has a place in Wisconsin just a couple of hours north. Don't have to go very far to get away from the lights, but in the middle of the night when it's dark with no lights in the sky, no moon, no stars, simply being on an empty road is a leap of faith that there isn't a car without lights on or a motorcycle running silently. Of course, electric cars are even worse in that respect because you don't get the engine noise. And it's sometimes darkness is scary, or maybe Wisconsin is scary. It depends on which lesson we want to take from this. Now, we know that the moon still has an impact in the world in which we live. It continues to influence the tides, right? Draws the water closer to shore and then allows it to recede. And for those who still work in maritime activities, fishing, shipping, sailing, they know the moon. And knowing the moon cycle for the tide cycle is still important to them. And those activities provide us with entertainment, with sustenance, with material goods. If there were no shipping, that would be a disaster. But most of the time, for the vast majority of us in first world countries, the tides are interesting, but they're not seen as essential. So you take your boat out next weekend instead of this weekend. Your sandcastle didn't survive to the next day. Well, it doesn't seem to be a core part of who we are. In fact, here's a map of the moon phases through a particular calendar year. And you'll see how it has nothing to do with the beginning of the month or the end of the month. There's no particular date. You can see it doesn't really fully line up because the new moon and the full moon are shifting around through the calendar that we use in the general, secular world. And sometimes you'll even have two full moons in one month, what's colloquially called a blue moon, because the moon is not really relevant to the counting of time anymore in the world in which we live. Now, for a long time, the moon didn't just have practical significance, it also had emotional significance. It was something to aspire to. In Greek mythology, the moon was referred to by the goddess, or the Titan actually, Selene. In Roman mythology, her name was Luna. Makes sense? Luna, or Selene, also drove a chariot across the sky, just opposite to her brother Helios. We think of the words, shoot for the moon, right? And we did. We had a moonshot. We tried to get to the moon in person. And that moon race culminated on July 20th, 1969, 55 years ago, last Saturday, when human beings actually set foot on the lunar surface. Since that time, we've learned even more about the history of the moon, the composition of the moon, its role in occasionally intercepting meteors that were coming to smash into the Earth, the moon's birth from the Earth itself after a cataclysmic collision, and its composition that could possibly make the moon a stepping stone to exploring even further into space. We made it to the moon, and we can do so much more. But do we need people? Robots, after all, are much more efficient and don't need food and air and water. So we might explore more without people. And maybe the most important discovery from the moon was what we learned about the Earth. If I can get the image. There we go. This is a famous image. It's called Earthrise. This was actually taken in 1968, before people had landed on the moon. This was a probe going around the moon as a test run before landing on the moon. But seeing the Earth emerge from behind the shadow of the moon showed how vulnerable the planet was. It helped to spark the environmental movement in the later 1970s. It shows tremendous activity with the storms and the clouds and everything. It's a marvelous image of who we are. But the moon is the backdrop. The moon is the setting. We didn't need necessarily, we could have looked back at Earth from far away anyways. The moon just happened to be where we were. It was a renewed perspective on the Earth with the moon in the background. So let me ask you, today, would you say that the moon is important to humanity? If so, why? Here you go.
NASA and China are in the middle of a space race to get to the moon, send people back to the moon. So in a sense, it is important. And there's talk about mining on the moon for helium-3 to use for fusion reactors.
Right. So that would again be that launch for David, if you wouldn't mind thinking.
You're going to launch that. So it's also, of course, it controls the tides of the oceans. And so very important for that.
Right. We need it, but do we notice it?
Well,
Maybe not that often.
but if we're manning a ship, or, obviously that's important to know. And we get a lot of products on ships, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Without it, how would musicians have created Shine on Harvest Moon?
There's a lot of songs about it, for sure.
Inspiration.
Yes. Yes.
One last one, the calendars, the lunar calendar, which is the Hebrew and the Arabic calendar, versus the solar calendar. The Persians use a solar calendar.
So for those cultures that do, Jeremy, please, for those cultures that do use the moon, it's still relevant. We'll talk about one of them in Jewish culture in just a moment.
Without the moon, we would not have lunatics.
Well, you see the connection linguistically anyways.
Loonies.
Yes. Well, the other thing I'll point out, of course, when we turn to cultures that do value the moon, is there was a long time debate in Jewish life, I've mentioned before, about which was more important, the sun or the moon. And the answer the Jewish culture provided was that the moon was more important because the sun is out when it's light out, but the moon is out when it's dark and you need it. So the moon must be the more important object. Of course, the irony in that joke is that the light of the moon is the light of the sun. It's the sun reflecting off the moon. That's why we get the shadow. That's us blocking that sunlight. Now, there are other Jewish moon connections. You might not have known that there is actually a crater on the moon, which is named Rabbi Levi, after a 14th century Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, or Gersonides in his Arabic name, who was an early astronomer, among other things. So he discovered this crater and they named it after him. But Jewish connections with the moon are much deeper and older than Rabbi Gersonides in the 1300s. For the Jewish calendar, the moon was very important for telling time, and maybe even more important than the sun in that respect, because Jews didn't really mark the equinox and the solstice, but they did mark the new moons. And the Jews were not the only people in the Middle East marking new moons and full moons and new moons and full moons. They used this concept of this intermediate time between the day and the year that ultimately we call in English the month, or the month, which is where it comes from. The Babylonian calendar had a moment in each month that they called Shabbatum. Shabbatum was when the full moon was out, and it was thought to be dangerous to work or to leave one's house. Does this sound at all familiar? Something from Jewish life called Shabbat? Now, the Hebrew Bible's calendar of Jewish observances includes special sacrifices and prayers for the new moon. It includes a calendar of Jewish holidays that's organized so that many festivals fall on the 15th of the month, which is a full moon. Jewish months are designed that way. And there are a number of Jewish holidays that land on those dates. So here's an example of, let me jump to the right image here. Here's an example of a calendar that matches the Jewish month. If you notice, the 15th of the month is a full moon. And the first of the month is the beginning, the first sliver of the new moon. And the very end of the month, the 28th or 29th day, or sometimes the 30th day, because the moon cycle is actually 29 and a half days. Why should it be easy? The 29th or 30th day is going to be the totally dark sky out there. Now, this is how the Jewish calendar works. And here are some examples of holidays that land on the 15th of the month. Sukkot, the fall harvest holiday, is on the 15th of the month. Purim, the midwinter holiday, that's sort of like the Mardi Gras of Jewish life, that ends on the 14th of the month. Passover is on the 15th of the month. Tu B'Shvat is on the 15th of the month. Tu B'Av is on the 15th. So there's all these holidays marked on the 15th of the month. It's not a coincidence that it happens to also be a full moon. Even Hanukkah is a moon festival if you think about it correctly. Now, we call Hanukkah a celebration of light. In fact, on the menorah, the center candle is called the shamash, the sun. It has a clear connection to that. But it's also a celebration of celestial darkness. Now, in a month of 29 to 30 days following the moon cycle that you can see, which are the darkest nights? It'd be when there's limited moon, right? Well, Hanukkah does not start on the 15th of the month. Hanukkah starts on the 25th of Kislev, which is the month closest to the winter solstice. So the 25th of that month, what we would call December/January, the 25th of that month is going to be the darkest nights, you see? And then it begins to get bright again by the end. There's the 25th of the first, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 1, 2, 3. By the third night, by the last night of Hanukkah, that moon is returning. So these are not just dark nights, they are the longest, darkest nights of the year. You could call Hanukkah a festival of darkness as much as it is a festival of light. But that's because of the connection to the moon cycle. Now, that Jewish connection with the moon is also based on nature. 2,000 years ago, the new moon was decided by the observation of the new moon. Someone had to see it. And then they reported to the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court, based on witnesses. The Hebrew word for a month is chodesh. The Hebrew word for new, like new voice, is Hadash. So Chodesh, Hadash, they're obviously connected, right? It's the new moon, the new month. And this brings back one of my favorite paradoxes in Jewish law. I think I might have talked about this at a High Holiday sermon recently. Because it's 29 or 30 days, you need this observation to decide. And what if you had a witness who claimed they saw the moon, but the witness turned 13 years old on the first day of the next month? Well, if they were correct and saw the moon, then it was the first day of the month. They're 13 years old. They're a valid witness. But if they were wrong and they didn't really see the moon, then it's the 29th or the 30th of the month before, and they're not a valid witness. It's this paradox of Jewish law of whether the person is a valid witness or not, based on whether they actually saw the moon or not. There's a Jewish tradition called Kiddush HaLevana, the sanctifying of the white thing of the moon, of going out on a clear night after the new moon has appeared to bless the new moon. You can do it anytime within the first week and a half or so of that. So you wait for a clear night to happen because you don't want to bless it when you can't see it. And you go out and you say a special blessing for the moon. Technically, you're blessing the God who makes the moon happen, but that's how it often works in Jewish life. And there's even a tradition of a special letter size, like a font, called Kiddush HaLevana letters, which are extra big, so you can see them in the dark. And it actually works. If you have something printed big, it's a lot easier to see in the dark than something small. Now, there is one more Jewish connection with the moon to highlight, and that is this appearance of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh, has also traditionally been identified with women. I don't think it's an accident that even in Roman mythology or Greek mythology, Selene, Luna, was a woman, a female god, a goddess, because the moon has often been connected to women. The connection between biological women and the moon cycle works on multiple levels. Obviously, you have the menstrual cycle, as I've been told, is on average 27 to 29 days with some variation. And also, one could describe the moon as becoming pregnant and growing and growing, and then gradually shrinking back down again and again, and then the next cycle happens. In traditional Jewish observances, you had additional synagogue blessings and prayers, reciting the text describing the sacrifices that were held in Jerusalem when the temple stood. But there was a custom, not a law, but a custom that women didn't have to work on Rosh Chodesh. So they got one day off at the beginning of the month. In recent times, as Jewish feminists have been looking back into Jewish tradition, trying to find ways to reclaim the value of women in Jewish life, they've connected with Rosh Chodesh as an observance specifically attached to women. And again, with those associations that I mentioned with biological women, at least, they have felt a strong connection to this concept of Rosh Chodesh and have re-enlivened it with Jewish feminist observances and meditation retreats and nature events and so on. So the question I have for you is, should we as a humanistic Jewish congregation reclaim some of these Rosh Chodesh observances specifically for humanistic Jewish women? Or is it too biologically essentialist to tie it to the monthly menstrual cycle, which many young women don't have and older women don't have and some women never have? And is it too simplistic to do it that way? And more broadly, are we okay with gender-specific programs and rituals? Or do we strive for neutrality and inclusion and equality so every program is open to everybody? Or can we have that separate gender space for observances, especially ones reclaiming traditionally Jewish and women-identified programs? So I'm curious for your thoughts, having heard just this little bit about the moon and Jewish life and Rosh Chodesh. Is this something that would be worth our exploration, or something that we would want to keep? And Cindy's pointing out that trans men, non-binary folks, sometimes also experience menstruation. So if that's the primary connection, then that might be a challenge. So any thoughts on what does Rosh Chodesh mean for us?
I'll respond.
Sure.
I think there is value in affinity groups, but I'm not certain they need to be connected to the moon. So I think there's value in people who are similar to each other getting together to talk for whatever that is and whatever those similarities are. That's what an affinity group is. But I'm not certain that the moon or celestial or otherwise ritual issues need to drive that.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I want to go this way. Please, Marjorie.
I would take the opposite point of view. I would go for an inclusion type of group because men can be feminists, just like women can be feminists. And men and women can understand similar issues and I think benefit from bringing their points of view to different kinds of questions and issues. I would be for inclusion.
And I'll respond with just a both and. That there is value in affinity groups and there are value in heterogeneous groups.
There's no one answer, right? There's no one meaning to what the moon can mean or should mean. This is one of those ongoing conversations that Jewish culture will have and Jewish communities will have over the years. The moon has many levels of importance. Is this going to move? There we go. The moon has many levels of importance today for Jews, for human beings, for anyone to feel a connection with the natural world. You feel part of the universe in a meaningful way. We were fortunate in the Midwest over the last decade or so. We've had 2 experiences of something called a solar eclipse. Hopefully you had a chance to see some of it, even if it was only the partial and not the total eclipse. I found those to be very powerful moments. We experienced one in Southern Illinois, another one in Ohio. You feel very small, but you also feel connected to the universe because you're seeing the moon move across the sun. Like you're seeing these bodies orbiting in real life, not in a video and not in a simulation and not in, toy objects that you've built on a Lego set or something. This is real celestial movement. This is feeling part of the universe. So you feel small, but you feel connected to something so much larger than yourself. In many ways, the moon inspired the invention of telescopes to look closer, to see more. And once we looked out, we also learned we could look in and down and understood more about the life here and now. There's a marvelous, about 10-minute documentary from the 1980s called Powers of 10, which starts with a couple sitting on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, actually, and they zoom out 10 meters, 100 meters, 1,000 meters, on and on to the end of the universe. And then they go back to that person and they zoom in on their hand again, another order of 10, another magnitude of 10. And what's amazing is at the subatomic level and the massive cosmic level, it begins to look the same. That's the power of the moon as an stand-in, as a bridge, as a trigger to think about our place in the entire universe. We find the truth that lies beyond our grasp, beneath the surface. And so I want to conclude with a short poem by the Israeli poet Leah Goldberg, where she draws on the concept of the moon as an expression of the passage of time, but also the power of loving connection. It's called Remembrance of the Beginnings of Things. We shall remember the wheat stalk in the greenness of her youth, the time she stood erect with head to heaven. Thin was her blade, but straight and proud. And now bent is her head to the ground, for heavy is the gold of her ripeness, the crown of her full pregnancy. Beautiful are her seasons. We shall remember the tree in the middle of his spring. His blossoms were white and pink. Trembling sunbeams glimmered in him on the branch, and the sweet resin dropped to earth like the bride's tears on the day of her heart's joy. Now he stands in the abundance of his apples, carrying his beautiful burden motionless, knowing the spring of things to come. We shall surely remember these things in the change of the year's circuit and in the passage of day and night, how the moon was fragile and very full, then round and died, yet its youth would be renewed. We shall surely remember the beginning of our love, when she was tremulous as a fawn, a beautiful doe lowering her eyes, and there she has become fully grown, with her open face and her deep voice. Beautiful are her seasons. Hope you enjoyed this cosmic journey through the moon and back. There's even a wonderful kids story these days called To the Moon and Back, or To the Moon and Beyond. So this is one of those symbols that will continue to resonate in Jewish life and in the human experience.